G'day, ZiggyD here with my first coverage of the much requested The Incredible Adventures of Van Helsing. Seriously, I don't think I've ever had a game requested quite as much as this particular one. I've had people leaving me comments, people leaving comments on my actual channel, people sending me messages, and even subscribers buying me this game so I could cover it. So that's pretty exciting because it was pretty low on my radar, to be honest. Like, I was planning on maybe checking it out, but then the Grim Dawn alpha came along and I spent my budget for the month on that one, so I wasn't looking to play this, but it seems like people are really keen on this game, and after playing for a couple hours so far, I'm starting to see why. So in this video I'll give you guys a bit of a rundown of the game mechanics and my initial thoughts on it after playing for a few hours. So first thing I want to cover is like the general look of the game, the story, the lore, the voiceovers, all of that sort of jazz. And this is actually something that I think has a really strong appeal in this particular game. I especially love some of the voiceovers. Now, the voice acting isn't fantastic, but it's got a lot of character in it. It's interesting talking to NPCs. Like, for example, this elder here.
Smells like brimstone.
I just love this guy's voiceovers when you talk to him. The end is nigh. And they all have very unique and interesting voiceovers. And there's also a lot of banter between yourself and your companion. So basically, you have this companion here, Lady Katarina, who's a ghost. And she can transform between various forms. And there's often a fair bit of witty banter between these two characters during quests. And when you tell her to go back to town in the Torchlight style, that sort of thing happens. Overall, it's got a pretty traditional looking action RPG. Semi-gritty, semi-fantasy setting. It's set in, Borgovia, the fantasy realm of Van Helsing, and it's got that sort of theming to it, which overall I think has a lot of charm to it, and overall I've enjoyed the look of it. In terms of customization of your character in the way that he looks, if I can open up my inventory here, your gear is represented on characters. Now, I only really bring this up because we've looked at Marvel Heroes recently where that same sort of thing didn't happen, so it's sort of like a semi-representation. Your gear becomes more impressive as you put different types of gear on. As you can see, I'll take the chest piece off here, and there's minor changes from these things, and different weapons look different, and different swords and things look different as well, so yeah, you can switch between the one-handed and the two-handed swords and all that jazz. So overall, a pretty good-looking game. So now let's take a bit of a travel to this new zone here, the Ink Rift, and I'll run you guys through the combat and skills system because this is pretty interesting stuff. So right away, I'm just going to use some fireballs here. The character I'm creating on this particular run-through is mostly focused on being a caster. So trying to do as much as I can with spell damage and fire and things like that. So, overall the controls are pretty tight. It's easy to switch between ranged and melee weapons to and use your different skills and things like that. So let's go ahead and use my little fire aura here, and we'll use my melee weapon. And I can easily jump back into ranged attacks and do that, and switch over to my ranged spell and do that sort of thing. So this realm, which you might be if you haven't seen this game yet, is the Ink realm. It's kind of like a parallel universe where things are a little bit crazy, and you can travel through this to reach other places. And so far, various quests have taken me here. So it's pretty interesting, and certainly a very different area. I kind of like all the floating rocks and the different islands with the mystical bridges and things joining everything together. So now let's jump into the skill system, because this is a big point of appeal, or a big point of discussion for this particular game, because it's quite unique. So basically, you don't have a skill bar where you don't have hotkeys like A through F or 1 through 4 or anything like that that are tied to abilities. Instead, you only have left click and right click abilities. Now, these can be further extended out by having a melee weapon set and a ranged weapon set, and you can set these up between each one. So for example, I can put lightning strike on my left and have this spell here on my right. So you can change those around a fair bit. And then on top of that, you also have, so within the melee set, I have basically I can press tab to switch between two different presets, and I can do the same thing with range. So you can have a grand total of 8 possible skills. Now, the skill system, like, that seems pretty limited compared to a lot of games where you might have a large skill bar with a lot of action RPGs, and it kind of is, but to increase the flexibility and the different things you can do with skills, you get these sort of modifiers. Now basically, as you kill enemies, you develop this rage meter here, and I can spend that rage each time I want to use an ability. So let's say with my fireball, I can put rage 1 level, 2 level, 3 levels, and I can do that with I can do that by pressing the 2 key. So I can go 2, 2, 2, and that'll pump that up. and that'll increase the damage. Or I can go 3, 3, 3, and it'll increase the radius of effect. And you can also unlock these separate other ones in the skill tree. So if I open up the skill tree here, you can see that there's all these different modifiers for each skill. And the UI is beautiful, by the way, on that point there. So that means during combat, you actually have a fair bit of flexibility into how you want to line up your skills. You can also just press space to go to a preset combo. So basically I can set this combo up to be, whenever I press space, one point of rage will go into both damage and blast radius, but I'll set it up so it can be, let's go 100% extra damage and 1 extra meter of blast radius. So once I've pumped that up, if I cast a fireball without that, it would just be a standard fireball with not too much damage, not too much blast radius, but if I pump that up by pressing spacebar, I can cast my fireball with increased blast radius and increased damage. So pretty impressive and interesting. Now you can do this with your main attacks and whatever other skills you unlock those modifiers for. Now here is the bad part about this system. It's extremely tedious. So they've done this fairly unique skill system, which is certainly very interesting to look at and play around with and talk about. And you know, it's very different. So huge props to the game for doing something very different. But in actual practice, when playing the game, it's kind of tedious to have to either set. Let's say I can only ever have 2 skills active at once, and in practice, most of the time, I'm just using my preset. I'm not usually thinking too much about, you know, oh, maybe if I arranged it this way during combat, because you need to be fairly quick during combat. So I'm usually just pressing space whenever I have rage, and it's pumping those up, and then I'm using them. Now, as I said, it can be quite tedious then, because if I want to say, I want to use my flaming spear, but I also want to have my shoot ability next to me, because it's good to have a main attack that doesn't cost mana, and then say I want to use my embracing flames. I actually have to switch weapon sets or press tab to do that each time I want to use one of those skills. So just switching between the various skills. Usually, you know, in order to make an action RPG interesting, you want to at least have access to 2 skills that you can use all the time, in addition to like a main sort of attack. So let's go ahead and use my skill here. Then I've got to switch over and then pump it up and then use my melee attack there. And then if I want to switch back to my spell, I have to switch my weapon set or press tab again. So there's a lot of switching going on there, in addition to also pumping up. So each time you want to use your skills. Let's just see if I can avoid dying here. That'll bring me. I'll talk about the difficulty in a moment, because that's actually pretty good. But yeah, there's a lot of switching going on between skills, and in addition to each time you want to use one of your skills, you have to put your modifiers on it to, you know, so either press space or press 1 and 2 and things like that to make those modifiers happen. So there's a lot of fiddling around with your weapon sets, and which you become used to after a while. Like it becomes much more fluid. It's a little bit tricky to adapt to at the start if you're used to a normal action RPG setup. But I guess what it comes down to, it's interesting but more tedious than a traditional action RPG setup. So I guess that'll be my final thoughts on that. I'm sure some people will feel differently about it, but I don't know. I could see myself getting tired in the long run of having to constantly pump up and switch between skills, especially if I want to make a build that uses, you know, 4 different skills. I might have to, you know, cast 1 skill on this weapon set, cast 1 skill on this weapon set, switch back, press tab, and then switch back, and then press tab, and then, you know, constantly be adjusting between these different skills just to do that. Whereas if I had it on a toolbar, I could just press to each one of those skills. I guess the trade-off then is that maybe if they went for the more traditional setup, you wouldn't be able to have these interesting modifiers systems. So it's a bit of a trade-off, making it more tedious in exchange for having a more interesting and, you know, custom system over other action RPGs. So that's enough labouring of that point. The actual combat itself is pretty satisfying, you know, apart from that. The skills I've played around with so far are fun. As you can see, that AoE attack is very effective. It's kind of interesting because if it hits a target, it'll burst on the edge of the pack, but if you can angle yourself around and get it in the middle of the pack, it just causes mayhem, so that's pretty good. The melee attacks are kind of satisfying. Ranged attacks kind of don't feel like they have enough pop to them, like they're not quite as explosive feeling as I'd expect older guns to feel like. Instead it's like doom, doom, boom, 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 doom, and I'm gonna die. But you know, as I said, the skills are the main part, and you can absolutely cause mayhem with those, so that's pretty cool. Like, and I got my other skill here, which is kind of cool to be able to stand there, slaying enemies as well. Oh, getting slayed myself. So the respawn system when you die, is a good point to go over that, is a lot like Torchlight, where you have to expend a certain amount to either respawn here, respawn at the checkpoint, or respawn back in town for free. So I'll just respawn back at the checkpoint. I thought I must have just got a checkpoint right here. Well, there you go, I saved a little bit of gold. But let's switch between my skills without dying. There we go. So that brings me on to the difficulty. Basically, whenever you start a new character, and I don't know if you can adjust it afterwards as well, you might be able to, you have access to a, I need to reset up my skills properly, a difficulty selection. Now this isn't like your traditional action RPG difficulty, instead it's an actual difficulty rating, which you can start from the very start of the game. So I'm playing on the second hardest difficulty instead of normal, which in addition to, you know, just making the game more challenging and interesting, it also gives you bonus item find, which is good. It has a reward for the difficulty system. You can play at a more challenging, you can have a more challenging experience, much more, difficult overall, and it definitely is. Like, the first major boss that I came across, I had to do like 3 or 4 times before I could successfully do it. I'd get surrounded and I'd get killed, or I'd accidentally get hit by an attack and get killed. So the difficulty setting on the second hardest difficulty feels pretty difficult. I think I'd need to be very experienced with the game to play through all of the way on the hardest difficulty setting. And then if I did that, I would have an additional reward, which is good. I feel like that's an excellent thing to have in the game, that instead of just grinding through. Because normally you have to grind through the normal difficulty and it's super easy, and the game only starts to get satisfying as you get into the higher difficulties. But this can be very satisfying and difficult right from the outside, so that's pretty cool stuff. So now I'll jump into the actual skill system, because I talked about how you used your skills, but let's take a look at what the actual skills are, because this is, the customization sort of side of things, and that's what makes, if you can make interesting builds, that's what makes this sort of game interesting. So overall, it's much more simple than other action RPGs. It looks pretty complicated because of all these extra little bits you can get and things like that, but there's not really that many skills. For example, I'm trying to build a pure spellcaster in this, and basically I have access to this spell, and this spell, and then the only other spell is Embracing Flames here, and I guess I could probably go for Ice Blast as well, though I don't think that'll be too useful for me. Otherwise, you have your different types of melee attacks. There's quite a few melee attacks, so you can go down this route, or you can go down this route, and then ranged attacks as well, which go down this way, or go down this way. There's some skills that sort of cross over between being a melee and a spellcasting, like this Lightning Strike uses some of your melee damage and also some of your spellcasting damage, so there's a bit of crossover between them. And there's also some different passive skills in each of these trees here, which benefit the things in that tree, although there's a bit of crossover between those two, because some of those could help the either tree. Now, there's a lot of bonuses in this game to specializing. If you specialize in the Occult Hunter tree here, you get this bonus here, which 10% increases all of the skills in this by 10%. As you sink more points into it, that increases. As you can see, Mystic Warrior, because I only have a couple points spent in here, I've only got 3% bonus there. In addition to these skills, there's Tricks and Auras. You learn these from NPCs, and you can put levels into them using your same skill points that you could otherwise spend in here. So, like for example, my heal or my increased critical damage at full rage capacity. And you can learn various other ones usually for gold from NPCs in town, or other ones that you rescue and things like that. The actual skills are fairly limited. There's as I said, there's not too many spells and there's not too many skills, but because of this system, you can put points into the modifiers that you find interesting, and also grab these extra passive points once you sink enough points into them. And because of the setup only allowing you to have access, easy access to 2 or 4 skills if you want to do a lot of sort of switching around. This means I think that people will be more specialized in this game. So there's still a good potential for a good amount of builds. Like I could easily specialize in, 2 different types of melee attacks. So maybe I'd go for something like Bash and Earthquake, or I could be like a ranged attacker using like Explosive Shot and then like Poison Shot, or Freeze Shot and Poison Shot, and switching between that and my normal attack. Or I can do what I'm doing and go for different spellcasters, trying to go for different flame spells and things like that. And then there's a lot of synergies into these things. So still a good amount of build depth, but nothing on the scope of Path of Exile. It feels much more similar to Torchlight in terms of the actual depth, though obviously it's a very different system there. In addition to those, you have your normal character stats, which you've got 4. You've got Body, Dexterity, Willpower, and Luck. Luck increases your Gold and Magic Find, so it's an extra stat that does that, as well as Dodging, so it's a nice one for pretty much all classes. Willpower is just for pure casters. Obviously, it does your mana, so allowing you to use your skills more, and also increases the damage of spells. dexterity for ranged attacks pretty much purely, and body for melee attacks and hit points. So you can, as I said, this game really seems to favour a lot of specialisation. So if you're specialising in certain skills to get this bonus in the skill system here, to get this bonus here, then you might also be wanting to specialise as much as possible into one particular thing. So I'm sinking a lot of points into willpower, some points into luck, and some points into body just for the hit points, even though I'm not using too many melee attacks. So yeah, a lot of bonuses for specialisation. Now on top of that, you also have this perk system, which is interesting, and it's cool to get perks. I like having perks in games like this. And this, as you earn reputation by doing great deeds, you are able to unlock these. But I haven't actually seen these perks increase in any way since I've been taking them. So it kind of feels like you're mostly just picking the order you get the perks in, rather than you might eventually be able to end up with getting pretty much all of these, or maybe you'll unlock more as you go. As I said, this is still a first impressions video, so there might be some things that I haven't discovered yet in regards to perks, but still an interesting system. Some of the perks have some interesting modifiers on them. So in addition to that, Lady Katarina, your follower, can also be customized. She levels up with you and you can sink points into her. I'm sinking all points into luck for that sweet magic find. And she also has 3 setups. She can be a melee attacker, a ranged attacker, or just a passive attacker that doesn't get involved in combat, but gives you resistance against damage. So she gives you a little buff there. That's kind of the route I'm going for, since I want to pump a lot of points into luck. If you wanted to make her tanky, you could sink a lot of points into body and willpower, or into dexterity if you wanted to be a ranged attacker, and things like that, things of that nature. You can also gear her up, and she has some skills as well. Mostly, they're all passives, but a few of them link better to her being an attacker, and some of them link better to her, being basically a lucky charm, like I'm setting up like here with this passive skill here. Let's sink some points more into her being a lucky charm there. So still, there's a lot of different systems. They all seem to encourage specialization, and you can specialize in each one of those to make those make a fairly interesting build. So I think there's probably good potential for replayability in this. You could easily play a ranged character, a melee character, and a caster, and have an enjoyable and fairly different experience each time. So overall, pretty impressed with that. Again, it all just then comes back to the tedious system of switching between your ranged and melee, and between the skills in that, and not having access to all of those skills at once. Alright, so now I'm back in town. I'm going to talk to you guys about the itemization system to round things off, because obviously that's a huge part of any action RPG, is whether the gear and the loot you get is fairly interesting. Okay, so the base system is pretty basic. You have your basic rarities: blue, rare, legendary. I don't know if there's anything like sets or anything like that, but those are pretty basic. You've got increased primary stats, increased secondary stats, so you can get body, dexterity, willpower, and luck on gear, which, as you can see, I've got willpower here, but you can also get secondary stats like spell power comes from willpower, but I can also get that on the sword. So this sword I've got spell power and willpower on. And then you can get bonus to damage, bonus to physical damage, bonus to HP, all of that good jazz. On some rare pieces of gear, like I've got this legendary ring here, or this epic ring, sorry, you can get bonuses to skills as well. So that's pretty good. That's always good to have, I think, skills on gear. It makes creating builds a bit more interesting. In addition to that, we sort of moving into the sort of crafting system is essences. So some gear has the ability to hold essences. So let's go into this store. We might be able to see some other ones in here. It looks like there's none in here that'll hold essences, unfortunately. But as you can see, this amulet here can hold a certain amount of essence. It can hold a maximum of 25 power of essence, essentially. Now, as you're finding enemies, you'll find these essences, and I actually don't have any. I've sunk a bunch. Oh no, I do have any. I do have some. There we go. You'll find these essences, which go into this essence tab, and each one of those has set abilities, set extra stats. You can get critical damage on your weapon, dodge on your armor, and mana on your accessories. So if you go to one of these NPCs, you can talk to him and go to the laboratory. You can put your item in here, and then you can put an essence in here, so whatever essence you want. So this one will add HP to it, and then you pay an amount of gold to have that essence put into that gear. And say each one of these essence has an essence cost of 5, so that means I can put 5 total of those into this amulet. And I've put a few in there already, so I don't have any money to do that at the moment, unfortunately. But as you can see, I've sunk some in there in the past, so that's a good system in itself. It's also quite a good gold sink. Finding in general gold in this game is actually pretty useful because of these various different crafting systems. Now, in addition to this sort of item improvement through essences, there's also an enchanting system. Now, the enchantress is not in town. I found her as an NPC out in the wild. There's possibly multiple of these NPCs, but basically, you put the item you want to enchant, which I actually have some enchanted, so I can show you guys, into the enchantress's little UI there, and pay some gold, and she'll enchant a random stat onto it. So as you can see here, this epic ring, its base stats were 1 to flaming spear and 5 fire damage bonus. I put it in the enchantress, paid about 1,000 gold, and she enchanted it with magic item find. Excellent. So that was a pretty cool stat to have. So that plus the essences system mean you're spending quite a bit of gold into that. Now, if you instead don't want to spend any gold, or you don't have any gold to spend, or you don't need to upgrade any of the gear you have, but maybe you need a new piece of gear, then you have another option. You have the artifact forge. Now, this means you can put any 3 of items of the same rarity into this artifact forge here. So I'll put 3 magic items in here, any type of item, and you'll get a random item of that rarity back. So if you collect up a bunch of rares that aren't useful for you, but say I still need like a new rare trophy or a new rare sword, I can stick 3 rares in here and forge, and I'll get random one back that might be useful for me. So if you don't want to sell these, you don't need gold, or you don't need to upgrade, you can instead go through this system where you can combine items to get a rare one back. Basically, you can Hereditary Cube any 3 items together of the same rarity to have a chance of getting something better for yourself. So since I just got a ring here with some resistances and stuff on it, I'll put it on Katarina. I'm sure she'll appreciate that. So a fair bit of variety in the actual crafting and item enhancement systems, which is really, really good. I'm pretty impressed overall at that. Now, as I said, the base items themselves aren't too interesting, but there's all of the stats there are in the right places. Like, there's all of the different ones. There's primary, secondary, and tertiary stats, and also some skills and things like that. So plenty to do with, you can do plenty with, kitting out your character to optimize for your build well. Anyway, that pretty much rounds off my first impressions, thoughts. Overall, I'm having quite a bit of fun with this game. As I said, switching between the skill thing, that I kind of laboured that point, but it feels kind of tedious. It's not as hugely open in terms of builds and things like that, but it's a really, really solid game for the price of $15, I believe it is. Feels pretty amazing so far. Like, it's got a lot of character, a lot of charm, and some interesting other systems. It's certainly different to any other action RPG, so if you're getting tired of the action RPGs you're playing at the moment, this might be an excellent one to check out. Overall, I'm pretty impressed. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.